Most gardeners make the same mistake when they want their yard to look nicer. They go to a garden center and start buying things that were never meant to be expensive in the first place. A few decorative pots, a wooden border, a little garden ornament, a planter or two, and before long a simple afternoon project has turned into a bill that costs more than the plants themselves. I learned a different way a long time ago, and it started when I looked at a pile of old boards, broken bricks, empty cans, and a wheelbarrow with a flat tire, and realized I was looking at a garden full of possibilities. If you have old things sitting behind your shed, in the garage, or somewhere near the house that you keep telling yourself you will throw away one day, I want you to wait before you do that. Some of those things can become borders, planters, flower displays, paths, supports, and small decorations that make the whole garden feel more comfortable without spending much money at all. I have used this idea for years, and what I like most is that the finished garden does not look like a store display where everything matches perfectly. It looks lived in, useful, and natural. That matters to me, especially as I get older, because I would rather spend my money on good soil and plants than on decorations that simply sit there. An old gardener once showed me that the trick is not to ask what an object was made for, but to ask what else it could do. That simple way of thinking changed how I looked at almost everything around my property. A cracked wooden box was no longer rubbish. A few loose stones were no longer a problem. An old cup did not have to go into the trash just because it had lost its matching set. Even a worn ladder could have another useful season in the garden. Today, I want to show you 15 ideas that follow that same old approach, using things many people already have or can find for little or nothing. We will start with the simplest materials, then move toward a few ideas that can completely change an empty corner of the yard, and one of the last projects uses something that most people would never think of as garden decoration. The first thing I want you to stop doing is throwing away perfectly useful material just because it looks old. Most of the time, the garden does not need something new. It needs something placed in the right spot. I learned this when I started using old boards as simple garden edging. You do not need perfectly straight timber or freshly painted pieces. In fact, I prefer boards that already have a little weather on them because they fit into the garden much better. I lay them along the edge of a flower bed or vegetable patch, secure them with a few pieces of old wood or short stakes, and suddenly the bed looks finished and tidy. The important thing is not to make everything perfectly even. Leave some natural variation because that makes the garden feel relaxed instead of manufactured. Before using old wood, check that it is solid and free from obvious rot, sharp nails, or old paint that may contain unwanted chemicals. If a board has good, clean wood, it can serve you for years. Another thing I like to use is ordinary stones. Most people see a pile of stones and think they need to be moved somewhere else, but I see a free garden border. You can place larger stones around a tree, beside a path, or around a small flower bed. You do not need to glue them together or make a complicated wall. Just arrange them so they sit firmly and leave enough space for plants to grow between them. An old method I was shown years ago was to bury the bottom part of larger stones slightly into the soil. That keeps them from rolling and makes the border look as if it has always been there. There is another little detail that makes a big difference. Do not clean every stone until it looks brand new. A little dirt, moss, and natural color usually makes the garden look better. The same idea works with old bricks. Instead of buying decorative pavers, I sometimes use leftover bricks to create a short path between beds. You can lay them flat, place them on their sides, or mix the two styles if you have different sizes. What matters is that they are stable under your feet. And once you see how much character these simple materials add, you may start looking at the pile behind your shed in a completely different way. One of my favorite things to reuse in the garden is old kitchenware, because it gives you something that store-bought decorations usually cannot give you, a little bit of your own history. An old metal bowl, a chipped cup, a small saucepan, or a plate that no longer has a matching set can become a simple planter or a place for small flowers. I remember my wife once had a few old cups sitting in a cupboard because she did not want to throw them away, but nobody used them anymore. We took them outside, made sure they had drainage where possible, filled them with soil, and planted small herbs and flowers in them. Nothing expensive was involved, but that little row of cups beside the back door became one of the nicest parts of the garden. The old method here is very simple. Use small containers for small plants, and do not try to force a large plant into a tiny pot. If the container can safely hold soil and has enough drainage, it can often find a second life outside. Another thing I have used many times is the old wooden crate. These are especially useful because they already have the shape of a planter, but you can also turn them into shelves for pots or a simple storage place for garden tools. If the wood is still strong, I leave it mostly as it is. Sometimes I brush off the dirt and give it a light sanding around the edges so there are no splinters, but I do not try to make it look new. A few crates stacked at different heights can create a very simple display against a shed wall or fence. Put the taller plants toward the back and smaller pots toward the front, and suddenly an empty corner becomes useful. There is one mistake most people make with old containers, though. They put them directly on soil where water collects underneath and the wood stays wet for too long. I learned to raise crates slightly with small pieces of brick or stone so air can move underneath and excess water can escape. That small change can make an old box last much longer. And once you see what a few old cups and crates can do, you start noticing another object that almost everyone has somewhere, and that one can turn an empty wall or corner into something much more interesting. There is another old garden trick I use when a corner of the yard looks empty, but I do not want to spend money building something complicated. I take an old ladder and give it a new job. A wooden ladder that is no longer safe for climbing can become a simple plant stand against a wall, fence, or shed. I check it carefully first and make sure it is stable enough to stand on its own, because once you add pots, it becomes heavier than it looks. Then I lean it securely against something solid and place small containers on the steps. I like using herbs, small flowers, and trailing plants because they make use of the different heights without making the arrangement look crowded. There is an old habit here that is worth remembering. Do not fill every space. Leave some empty steps because the open wood makes the whole display easier to see and gives the plants room. You can also use an old wooden chair in much the same way. If the seat is still strong, put a large pot where a person would normally sit, and you have an instant raised planter. I have found this especially useful for people who do not want to bend down as much while tending flowers or herbs. The height makes watering and harvesting easier, and an old chair that might otherwise end up in a dump can become useful again. Another simple material is the ordinary metal can. Clean cans can become small containers for herbs or flowers, and you can keep them plain if you like a natural look. I prefer not to cover every old object with bright paint because sometimes the original material looks better beside green plants. If you want to paint them, use a suitable outdoor coating and make sure the container is clean and dry first. Put drainage holes in the bottom so water does not sit around the roots. A row of several cans can also make a neat little herb garden near the kitchen door. What I like about this idea is that you can make one today, see how it looks, and then add another later instead of trying to build everything at once. But the next object is even more useful because it can become both decoration and a practical part of the garden, and most people already have one sitting somewhere unused. One of the easiest ways to make an old garden look more interesting is to use things that already have a shape made for holding something. That is why I never rush to throw away an old wheelbarrow. If the wheel is damaged or the handles are worn but the body is still strong enough to hold soil, it can become a beautiful raised flower bed with almost no work. I usually place it where people can see it when they walk into the garden, because an old wheelbarrow naturally draws attention without looking like a decoration bought from a shop. Fill it with ordinary garden soil and use a mixture of flowers that bloom at different times, or plant herbs if you want something useful near the kitchen. There is one small detail I always check first. Make sure excess water can escape. because a container that stays soaked after rain will cause problems for the plants. If there is no opening at the bottom, make a few suitable drainage holes before adding soil. I learned this simple habit years ago, and it has saved many of my old containers from becoming useless. Another favorite is the old tire. I know tires are not beautiful when they are sitting behind a shed, but placed properly they can become simple raised planting beds. I have seen an older gardener use several old tires around his vegetable garden to separate different areas and give flowers their own little islands. You can leave the rubber plain if you prefer a very simple look, or use an outdoor paint suitable for the material and choose one calm color. I would not cover every tire in bright colors because too many colors can make a small garden feel busy. 1 or 2 tones are usually enough. Then there is the old kettle or teapot. Even a kettle that has become too worn for the kitchen can hold a small plant and become an unexpected little feature beside a path or on a table. I like these objects because they remind me of the old habit of using something until it truly has nothing left to give. Most people see a broken household item and think its useful life is over, but in the garden, it may have another purpose waiting for it. And there is one more old object that can turn a plain fence into a living wall without requiring much space, which is where this gets especially useful for smaller gardens. One of the best ideas for a small garden is to stop thinking only about the ground and start using the walls and fences you already have. I learned this from an older gardener who had a very narrow yard and almost no extra space for flower beds. He took an old wooden pallet, cleaned it, checked that it was solid, and stood it upright against a fence. Then he used the spaces between the boards for small pots of herbs and flowers. It was simple, but the empty fence suddenly looked useful and alive. If you try this, make sure the pallet is safe for garden use and avoid wood that has been treated with unknown chemicals. You can also use old boards to make a simple frame for hanging small containers. I like using tin cans, small buckets, or old jars for this because they are light and easy to move. A little rope or strong wire is enough to hang them securely, and you can arrange them at different heights so the display does not look too rigid. One thing I learned after making these displays is that you do not need every container to match. In fact, different shapes and old colors often make the garden feel more personal. Another almost free idea is using old glass bottles as a garden border. If you have enough bottles, place them carefully along the edge of a path or flower bed, with part of each bottle secured in the soil so it cannot move easily. Green, blue, and clear glass can catch the daylight and add a little color without needing paint. Take your time with this one because broken glass has sharp edges and should never be left where children, pets, or bare feet could reach it. I prefer using intact bottles and placing them where they are protected from regular foot traffic. And here is the part I really like about all these projects. You are not trying to hide the fact that the materials are old. You are giving them a useful place where their age actually looks right. That is something I noticed many years ago. A garden becomes more welcoming when every corner does not look newly purchased. But there are still a few old things sitting around the house that can make an even bigger difference, and one of them can change the garden after the sun goes down. By now, you can probably look around your own house and see things that you would normally throw away in a completely different way, and that is really the whole point of this kind of gardening. I do not want you to spend your weekend trying to make the garden look expensive. I want you to make it feel useful, comfortable, and like it belongs to you. One of my favorite final ideas is using old jars, small glass containers, or even sturdy metal holders to make simple garden lights. You can place a small safe outdoor light inside a jar and set it along a path, beside a flower bed, or near a sitting area. You do not need a complicated lighting system, and you do not need to turn the whole garden into something bright. A few small lights are enough to make the paths easier to see and give the garden a completely different feeling in the evening. Just make sure any electrical or lighting product you use is designed for outdoor conditions and keep ordinary household electrical items away from rain. Another thing I like doing is making simple signs from old pieces of wood. You can write the names of herbs, vegetables, or flowers on them with outdoor paint or a suitable marker and place them beside the plants. My grandchildren always liked reading those little signs when they visited, and it gave them a reason to walk through the garden and ask questions. You can also use old bricks as supports for a small bench, a pot stand, or a raised display, as long as everything is stable and safe. The important thing is to build only what you can trust to hold its weight. I have learned that the best garden projects are often the ones that do not look like projects at all. They simply look as though they have always belonged there. So, before you buy another decoration, walk around your shed, garage, basement, and garden and look again at what you already own. Old boards can become borders, stones can become paths, crates can become planters, ladders can become displays, tires can become beds, and forgotten household items can become useful little features. You may save some money, but I think the bigger reward is seeing something that was almost thrown away become useful again. And once you start thinking this way, you will probably find many more ideas than the 15 we covered today, because the next old thing you are about to throw away may be the best garden project you have ever made.